I moved to a remote town in Montana. There are strange rules to follow. I arrived in Redwood, Montana, on a frigid November night. The town was barely a dot on the map, isolated, still, and surrounded by vast pine forests that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was the kind of place where the scent of damp earth lingered in the air, where the sky seemed to go on forever, and where the silence felt like it seeped into your very bones. It was exactly what I needed. I was escaping my past, a failed marriage, a career that had drained me to nothing, and a life that had become suffocatingly small. I stumbled upon Redwood by chance, an online rental listing for a modest single-story home on the outskirts of town. The price was almost too good to be true. No neighbors in sight. Just me and the towering pine trees whispering beyond the backyard fence. It was perfect. The landlord, Mr. Lancaster, was an elderly man, thin as a stick, with a handshake as brittle as dry twigs. He gave me a brief tour of the house, barely speaking, but just before I signed the lease, he handed me a sheet of paper. It contained a list of rules. Redwood Township Night Watch rules, strictly enforced. Ensure all doors and windows are locked from 2 a.m. until sunrise. No exceptions. If you hear knocking between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., do not answer the door. There will be knocking. Ignore it. Should you hear whistling outside after 2 a.m., do not react. Shut your eyes. Cover your ears. Stay still. Under no circumstances should you step outside after 2 a.m., no matter the sounds you hear. Do not discuss these rules with anyone who is unaware of them. I had chuckled, assuming it was some small-town prank. Lancaster's expression remained unreadable. He merely slid the paper toward me. Read them. Obey them, he said in a quiet but firm voice. Or leave now. Something about the way he spoke, the unwavering stillness in his pale eyes, made my stomach twist. I accepted the paper. I moved in. I locked my doors. For the first several nights, nothing happened. Redwood felt like any other quiet town where the roads seemed deserted even in daylight, where the few people I encountered at the local gas station spoke in hushed tones and avoided eye contact. I convinced myself the rules were nothing more than passed-down folklore, a method to scare kids into staying inside at night. Then came the fifth night. At precisely 2:13 a.m., I awoke to the sound of knocking. Not a light tapping, but slow, deliberate, heavy thuds. One every 3 seconds. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed. 3 more knocks. I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. No conceivable reason for anyone to be at my door at this ungodly hour. Then, just as my breath caught in my throat, the knocking stopped. Silence stretched for 10 seconds. Then I heard it. A whistle. Soft, drifting through the trees. Almost musical, but wrong. It was moving. The sound glided past my house, growing louder before fading into the woods. I lay motionless in bed until the first light of dawn crept into the sky. That morning, when I stepped outside, I noticed footprints in the frost. Bare human footprints. They stretched from my front door all the way to the edge of the tree line. I hadn't been alone last night. And whatever had visited, it was aware of my presence. After that, sleep barely found me. The knocking. The eerie whistle. The footprints. It wasn't just my imagination. I knew what I had heard. I had seen those prints in the frost, yet when I ventured outside to inspect them, they stopped abruptly at the trees, vanishing, as if their owner had simply ceased to exist. The entire day, I was on edge, flinching at every insignificant noise. By midday, I couldn't bear to be in the house alone anymore, so I drove into town. Redwood wasn't large. It had a lone diner, a gas station, a post office, and a general store that appeared frozen in time since the 1970s. The few people I passed cast glances in my direction but quickly looked away, like I was something best ignored. Inside the diner, the aroma of coffee and bacon should have been reassuring. But it wasn't. The entire place felt subdued, as if wrapped in an unseen tension. I took a seat at the counter. A woman behind it, mid-40s, graying hair, with a name tag that read Linda, poured me a cup of coffee without asking. I hesitated before speaking. "Hey, can I ask you something?" She didn't look up. "Depends on what it is." I retrieved the piece of paper Mr. Lancaster had given me and slid it across the counter. "These rules, do they really mean something?" Linda froze mid-pour. For a moment, she was completely still. Then, slowly, she raised her eyes to meet mine. "You followed them last night?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah." She nodded once. "Good." I waited for her to say more, but she didn't. Instead, she picked up the coffee pot and moved further down the counter as if the conversation was finished. I tried again. "Look, something was outside my house." It knocked. And the whistling. Linda's grip tightened around the coffee pot. "Don't talk about it." Her voice was low and firm. I leaned in. "But what the hell is it?" For a second, I thought she might actually answer, but then she glanced over my shoulder, and her expression shifted, fear. I turned. An older man had just stepped into the diner. He was wiry, his skin weathered from years in the sun, dressed in a faded flannel jacket. But it wasn't his appearance that sent a chill through me, it was his eyes. Cold. Gray. Studying me with silent intensity. Linda turned away, suddenly busying herself with plates that didn't need cleaning. The other customers hunched lower over their meals. The tension in the air was suffocating. The old man walked directly toward me and stopped just a foot away. "You're new," he stated, his voice rough and gravelly. I nodded. "Yeah." "You heard it, didn't you?" I exhaled slowly. The whistling. The man's jaw tightened. He pulled out a chair and sat beside me. "Listen carefully, kid. You follow the rules. You don't talk about it. And you sure as hell don't go looking for answers." I felt my pulse in my throat. "Why not?" The man studied me for a long moment. Then he leaned in and whispered, "Because if it knows you're listening, it listens back." The diner door swung open. For a fleeting second, I thought I heard something outside, a soft, distant whistle carried by the wind. The old man stiffened. He stood abruptly and strode out of the diner without another word. I sat there, my coffee untouched, heart hammering. I wasn't losing my mind. The town knew. And whatever was out there, it knew about me now, too. I drove home from the diner, my thoughts tangled in knots. Linda's reaction. The way the old man had looked at me. That final thing he said, "If it knows you're listening, it listens back." I locked my doors the second I stepped inside. The house felt smaller, darker, as if the very walls had absorbed my unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that moving here had been a mistake. Yet, part of me clung to the idea that this was just another rural myth, a bizarre local superstition meant to keep people from wandering the woods at night. Maybe the knocking was some drunk messing around. Maybe the footprints were a trick of the morning frost. But the whistle, I had never heard anything like it before. That night, I sat in my living room with every light on, waiting. Listening. I kept the paper with the rules beside me on the table, reading them again and again. My fingers traced each line, stopping at Rule 3. If you hear whistling outside after 2 a.m., do not acknowledge it. Close your eyes. Cover your ears. Do not react. What would happen if I did react? I glanced at the clock. 1:47 a.m. 13 minutes. My breath came faster. My palms were damp. But I wasn't a believer in folklore. If I was going to live here, I needed to prove to myself that this was nothing. So I made a decision. At 1:59 a.m., I turned off every light. I sat in the darkness, heart pounding, staring out the window at the moonlit trees, and I waited. The silence pressed in on me. Every small noise, the house settling, the wind brushing against the glass, set my nerves on edge. Then, at precisely 2:07 a.m., it began. The knocking. My breath hitched. Just like before, slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy. I gripped the armrests of my chair, forcing myself to stay put. I bit my lip hard enough to taste blood. My fingers ached from gripping the chair. "Don't answer it. Don't move." Then the knocking ceased. A suffocating silence filled the house. And then, the whistle. Soft at first. A distant, drifting melody that curled through the trees. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound natural. It was getting closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart hammering. The sound grew louder. Too loud. As if whatever was making it was standing just outside my window. My breathing shallowed. Then, against every ounce of logic, I opened my eyes. A shadow passed by my window. Tall. Thin. Wrong. Not walking, gliding. It stopped. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, it turned its head toward me. The whistling stopped. My blood ran cold. It knew I had looked. I lunged off the chair and dove onto the floor, pressing myself against the carpet, hands clamped over my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that whatever was outside would just leave. The silence stretched. Seconds dragged into what felt like hours. Then, so softly, I almost doubted it was real, a whisper came through the glass. "I see you." I didn't sleep that night. And I didn't stop shaking until the sun finally rose. I didn't leave my house the next morning. I sat on the couch, hands still trembling, my mind replaying that moment over and over. The shadow gliding past my window. The way it had turned toward me, and that whisper. "I see you." It shouldn't have been possible. It couldn't be real. But I had felt it. The atmosphere in the room had shifted in that instant, like something ancient and starving had pressed against the glass, sensing me. Claiming me. I tried convincing myself it was just my exhausted mind playing tricks on me. But then I saw the footprints. They had returned. The frost on my porch had melted, yet the footprints remained, bare, human-like, unnervingly elongated, leading right up to my window. But the most disturbing part? They stopped there. The prints ended at the glass, as if whoever, or whatever, had simply stood there, watching. I yanked the curtain shut. I needed answers. By noon, I forced myself to leave the house. The paranoia clung to me, digging its claws deep into my thoughts. I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, half expecting to catch sight of a tall, thin figure lurking at the edge of the road. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. When I reached town, I went directly to the diner. Linda was behind the counter, wiping it down. The moment she spotted me, her expression darkened. "You looked, didn't you?" she muttered. My stomach clenched. "What are you talking about?" She let out a weary sigh and set down the rag. "People like you always think it's just a story," she said, shaking her head. "You assume we're just some small-town fools with old legends. But you don't get it. The rules aren't there to scare you. They exist to keep it from noticing you." I leaned in. "What happens now?" Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're marked," she said at last. "It knows you now. It'll keep watching. Testing you." My mouth was dry. How do I stop it? Linda hesitated, then slid something across the counter, a small jar of black salt. "Sprinkle this in a circle around your house every night," she instructed. "It won't stop it completely, but it might keep it out." My fingers tightened around the jar. "Might?" Linda exhaled sharply, leaning in closer. "It doesn't always follow the rules." A chair scraped loudly behind me. I turned. Earl Simmons was sitting in the corner, his eyes fixed on me. He didn't speak. He simply tapped his fingers against the table in a slow, steady rhythm, just like the knocking. I stared at him. His lips curled into the faintest smirk. I left the diner without finishing my coffee. That night, I did exactly as Linda told me. I spread the salt. I locked every door and window. And when the knocking started at 2:04 a.m., I didn't move. But this time, the knocking didn't stop. It just continued. And beneath it, beneath the steady thuds, I heard something else. Fingernails. Scraping against the glass. The knocking persisted. Slow. Methodical. Unyielding. It wasn't just at the front door now. It moved. A rhythmic knocking on the walls, the windows, the back door, a slow, deliberate circuit around my house. I sat curled on the couch, gripping my knees, heart hammering. The salt was supposed to be effective. Linda assured me it would help. But the knocking didn't stop. Then, at 2:37 a.m., it changed. The knocks softened. Became lighter. Like fingertips grazing the glass. Then, a voice. Not distant. Not whispering. This time, it was unmistakably clear. Right outside my window. Let me in. I stopped breathing. The voice was wrong. It sounded human, but there was something unnatural about it. Too measured. Too smooth. Like something mimicking speech but not quite grasping how it worked. I clenched my eyes shut. Don't respond. Don't acknowledge. The voice came again, even softer. You're scared. I can hear you breathing. I covered my mouth with both hands. Then came the whistle. Right outside the window. It was waiting for me to look. I almost did. I don't know what held me back. Sheer terror, maybe. But I refused to open my eyes. I pressed my forehead against my knees, willing myself to stay still. Then the voice changed. I froze. It was my voice now. Come outside. Just for a second. Ice flooded my veins. The knocking resumed, harder this time. The walls shuddered. Every instinct screamed at me to move. To run. But there was nowhere to go. Then, abrupt silence. I didn't move. A minute passed. Then another. The air in the room felt heavier, dense like water. Then, from outside, footsteps. Barefoot. Soft. Walking away. I didn't let myself relax. Not yet. Then, one final whisper. See you tomorrow. I remained curled up in that position until daylight broke. When morning arrived, I inspected the house. The salt circle around my home was untouched, not a single grain had shifted. But something else had. My front door was unlocked. I was absolutely certain I had locked it. Something had been inside during the night. Something had entered my home, and I had never even heard it come in. I didn't leave the house that morning. I just sat on the floor, staring at the unlocked door, gripping a kitchen knife in my trembling hands. The salt line was unbroken. That should have meant it couldn't get in. But the door, it was open. Which meant one of two things. Either I had forgotten to lock it, or worse. It had never been locked in the first place. I replayed the events of the previous night over and over. The knocking. The whispers. That thing outside mimicking my voice. And the part that haunted me the most, see you tomorrow. I had followed the rules. I hadn't looked. I hadn't acknowledged it. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. This wasn't just a test, it was playing with me. And deep down, I had a sickening feeling that it was only just beginning. By noon, I forced myself to drive into town. I needed answers. Linda wasn't at the diner, so I headed to the general store instead. A man in his 60s, grizzled, with deep-set lines etched into his face, stood behind the counter. His eyes locked onto me the moment I walked in. You're the new one. I hesitated. Yeah. He wiped his hands on an old rag. You seen it yet? My throat was dry. I heard it. His expression darkened. That's bad enough. I swallowed hard. What is it? He shook his head. Nobody knows. It's always been here. My granddad used to talk about it. Said the old ones, the people who lived in these woods before us, they had a name for it. They left. We stayed. I gripped the counter. How do I stop it? The man stared at me for a long moment. Then he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper, and what he said sent an icy dread through my entire body. You can't. I opened my mouth to argue, but then my eyes drifted to something behind him. On a bulletin board near the door, a collection of missing persons flyers was pinned in place. There had to be at least a dozen. Most of them were old, some dating back to the 90s, but a few looked recent. The clerk followed my gaze. Don't go outside, he warned, his voice grim. Not even once. Some of them, they stepped outside. I stared at the photos. Some of them? What about the others? The question sat heavy on my tongue, but I didn't ask it. Because I already knew the answer. They hadn't stepped outside. But they were gone anyway. That night, I bolted the doors. I laid down a fresh line of salt. I sat in my living room with my knife in my lap and waited. At 2:11 a.m., the knocking started. At 2:19 a.m., the whistling followed. At 2:24 a.m., I heard my own voice outside again. You're not safe in there. I squeezed my eyes shut. Covered my ears. Tried to block it out. Dear friends, please subscribe to the channel. It is very important for its development. Then, at 2:37 a.m., the closet door in the hallway creaked open. From inside the house. I sat frozen on the couch, gripping my knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. The knocking had stopped. The whistling had faded. But now, something was inside. The closet door had creaked open. Slowly. Deliberately. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to move, to do anything. But I couldn't. I remained there, locked in place, staring at the dark hallway, my pulse thundering in my ears. Then I heard it. A soft, dragging sound. Like bare feet sliding over the hardwood floor. Moving toward me. No. This wasn't supposed to happen. The rules were supposed to keep it outside. The dragging stopped, just beyond the living room doorway. I held my breath, forcing myself to stay as still as possible, my hands trembling around the knife. Then, in the silence, a voice spoke. My own voice. I can see you. A wave of cold terror washed over me. It was close. Right there. In the doorway. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I didn't. I clenched my eyes shut. Clamped my hands over my ears. Don't react. Don't acknowledge it. Then, the floor creaked. Directly in front of me. It was standing there. I could feel it. Too close. Then, warm breath against my ear. Why won't you look at me? Something cold and impossibly thin brushed against my arm. I recoiled instinctively. I couldn't help it. My eyes snapped open. Nothing was there. The room was empty. The hallway was empty. The closet door stood open. But whatever had come out of it was gone. But I wasn't relieved. Something had shifted. The air felt different, charged with an unfamiliar energy. It was as if the house no longer belonged solely to me. Then I heard it, one last sound from the hallway. A whisper. Not my own voice this time. Something else. Something layered, as if 100 voices spoke at once. Tomorrow, you will open the door. The breath caught in my throat. No. No, I wouldn't. I couldn't. But even as I denied it, I felt it, a deep, sickening pull in my chest. The thought was already planted inside me, like a command embedded in my mind. I remained awake until sunrise, trembling. For the first time since moving in, I doubted my ability to resist. I didn't sleep. Not that I was capable of it anymore. As soon as daylight touched the windows, I scoured every inch of the house. The doors remained locked. The windows secured. The salt circle remained undisturbed. And yet, something had been here last night. I could still sense it. The air hung heavier. The corners of each room appeared darker, stretched deeper. Shadows extended farther than they should. The walls seemed to breathe. Worst of all, I couldn't shake the thought of the door. The idea had rooted itself inside me, wrapping around my mind like vines tightening around a trellis. Tomorrow, you will open the door. I didn't want to. But what if I already had? What if, in some dazed, half-conscious state, I had let it in? The thought sent a shudder through me. I had to leave. Snatching my keys, I flung open the front door and sprinted to my car. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station on the far side of town. Inside, an older man behind the counter lifted his gaze as I entered. He took one look at my face and sighed, like he had seen this before. "You looked, didn't you?" I said nothing. I didn't need to. He motioned for me to step closer, lowering his voice. "You need to go." I swallowed hard. "Leave town?" He shook his head. "No. Leave the house. Tonight." "Why?" His eyes flickered to the windows, as if ensuring we weren't being overheard. "Because you can only resist for so long." I gripped the counter. "What does that mean?" He exhaled slowly. "No one opens the door by choice. But in the end, everyone does." A chill settled deep in my stomach. I stepped back. I don't understand." The man's expression darkened. "You will." That night, I tried everything. I barricaded the doors, stacking furniture against them. This time, I poured salt inside, covering the windowsills, the floor, the hallway. Every possible entrance. None of it mattered. At 2:03 a.m., the knocking began. Louder this time. More insistent. I pressed myself against the farthest wall, hands clamped over my ears. Don't listen. Don't react. The pounding grew stronger, rattling the walls. Then, at 2:17 a.m., the whispers started. Not outside. Inside. Right behind me. "The door is already open." A gasp tore from my throat as I turned. But there was no one there. No, this wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. I shut my eyes tightly, focused on my breathing. Then, I felt it. A hand. Cold. Thin fingers curling around mine. My breath hitched. My hand was on the doorknob. Turning it. I wrenched myself back, stumbling, heart hammering. I hadn't moved it. I swore I hadn't. But the doorknob kept turning. Slowly. Silently. Then, click. The lock released. The door began to open. Beyond it, darkness. Not the darkness of night. A void. An absence of everything. And within it, a tall, gaunt figure. It glided forward. My vision blurred. My body felt disconnected, no longer entirely mine. It whispered, inches from my face. "Time to go." And then, the lights flared on. Sunlight. Morning. The door was closed. The salt remained undisturbed. I stood motionless in the middle of my living room, my fingers still hovering above the doorknob. I gasped for breath and collapsed onto the floor. My entire body ached, as if I had been frozen in that position for hours. The whispers had faded. The knocking had ceased. But something inside me felt hollow, like I had left a part of myself on the other side of that door. And I had no idea how much longer I could resist the pull to reclaim it. At sunrise, I packed my bags. Breaking the lease didn't matter anymore, I just had to leave. I threw whatever I could into my car's trunk, my hands shaking, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't eat. I didn't shower. I just drove. I didn't stop until I was nearly 3 towns away, pulling into a cheap roadside motel, barely managing to steady my hand long enough to check in. That first night away from Redwood, I slept with the lights on, gripping the motel key as if it could protect me. No knocking. No whistling. No voices. It was over. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Days passed. Then weeks. I moved to another state, changed my phone number, convinced myself I was finally free. But I wasn't. Something had changed. Each night, I still dreamed of the door, the one I almost opened. Some nights, I saw the void beyond it. Other nights, I saw the shadowed figure stepping forward. And sometimes, I saw myself, standing in my living room, pulling the door wide open. And every time I woke up, my bedroom door was open. At first, I thought I was forgetting to close it. But then, one night, I locked it. Bolted it shut. Yet when morning came, the lock was still fastened, the bolt still secured. And the door stood open. I started sleeping in chairs, away from any doorways. But it didn't make a difference. Because last night, I heard it again. Not the knocking. Not the whistling. The whisper. Soft. Close. Right beside me. Come outside. And for one terrible second, my body nearly complied. My muscles tightened. My legs shifted. I felt myself leaning forward, as though something unseen was pulling me toward the door. I fought it. I won. But next time, I'm not sure if I will. Because the truth is, you can't escape it. It doesn't linger only in Redwood. It doesn't wait until 2 a.m. Once it knows you, it never looks away. And one day, sooner or later, I will open the door. Friends, write your impressions of the story in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and like us to get more content like this.